Are you an agent struggling to understand real estate economics? Would you benefit from learning how top agents structure their businesses? Then you've come to the right place. And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast. You know what? I was going to change my intro this week too, and I totally forgot to do so.
You would have thrown us way off.
Yeah, I was going to.
Are you going to change?
No, I'll do it next week.
So we're not starting over?
We're going to start over. And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast, where we teach you the basic economic and business principles you need to thrive in today's real estate market. I'm your host, Luke Pettersen, with my brothers and fellow nerds, Josh and AJ. What's going on with you guys today?
Not too much.
It's under 0 degrees outside.
Wow.
And AJ
So
doesn't have a car.
Cold.
Not much going on, though.
Uber in.
Did your car just freeze? Is that what happened?
Yeah.
The oil sender broke.
Or
I think
it
it
froze.
sends the oil.
Oil sender?
The sender.
That sounds like
I thought it was
people
I
know
thought
cars
she
would
said
know.
sensor, and I said, "Did you say sensor?" And she said sender.
Your car talks back to you?
No, the person at the dealership place.
Oh,
The
got
car
it.
Place.
You know what I just
ChatGPT.
thought of?
Wasn't my
I was just about to say, you imagine when ChatGPT gets into cars?
I didn't think of that.
Mhm.
What's wrong with my car? Here's what's wrong.
It's the oil sender. You're like, that's not a real thing.
That's going to change the world. All right, let's get into the Would You Rather of the week. Would you rather sell homes in the spring, summer, fall, or winter?
fall.
I like to sell homes when no one else is out shopping for homes. Typically happens for me in the winter, actually. So I tend to see a lot of success in the winter months when the market just goes really quiet. Buyers get discouraged, it seems like, in the spring and the summer. They compete in multiples, and then they're like, I'm discouraged, I'm going to disappear. And that's when I'm like, hey, my buyers, come on out. Because all the other buyers disappeared, and you can get great deals. And then first of the year, then everyone decides to come back out again, which is just chaos and crazy to me.
I like winter caveated with winter before January 1st. For those who don't know, in Minnesota, the Twin Cities market, our spring market starts on January 1st.
Yeah, I
Is
think
what I call
the
it.
soapbox point that I like to make here is try to be different than what everyone else is doing, because the reality is most agents go, well, my buyers are kind of starting to take a break. Maybe I should take a break now. Maybe take a break when you're tired in the middle of the chaos season, and then come back out when everyone else quits, because that's when you can actually have a lot of success and help a lot of people. It's a lot more fun to sell houses when you're not up against other people. Unless you're a listing agent, that's a lot more fun to sell houses. When
And we were actually, I was talking about this before Josh got in the room. I was telling AJ, it feels like every year we get into like Q4 and there's not many buyers in the market. And historically, I've always been like, hey guys, like maybe it
take a
makes
break.
No. Maybe it makes sense for you to buy a house now in Q4,
Yes.
then wait until your lease is up in May. Like use the buyout, get out of it. And I've had people get really good deals historically.
Yes.
And this year in Q4, though, I was looking at going, maybe they should wait until January when there's more listings and interest rates are maybe a little bit lower. And it's not going to be that competitive in January. There's no way. Interest rates are 6. Wrong.
Yeah, it's been crazy.
It's been crazy.
I like the fall. I mean, that is a point to the
Fall's a
fall,
good
right?
time.
Because
Yep.
like October, November are both fall-ish months here in Minnesota. I just think the weather is so much better. We're outside of the madness of the spring and the summer. Listing activity is usually pretty good in September and October.
Yep.
And yeah, and like I said, the weather's not so crappy. Like you can be outside in a t-shirt and be showing homes, and you get to see. A big thing too, typically you get to test the air conditioner. Typically you get to see the roof, and you get to see the landscaping, how the grading is, all those kinds of things that in the winter you just really don't get to know, how they were done.
Right. It depends on the client too, right? So if it's a single family client like we're talking about, or Luke mentioned, there wasn't a lot of inventory this winter. So it's like I can say all day long, you don't have to compete, but if there's nothing to buy, there's nothing to buy. But I would say like I have a lot of investor clients, and on November 1st every year I kind of start putting bugs in their ears like, hey guys, if you're looking to buy anything new, now is the best time that you can be out there looking for this, because you're just going to get a good deal on the buy side. You're going to make money in the front end, and you're going to be prepped and ready to go once the spring market comes to rent it.
I have a stat of the week then, just because we're talking about times of the year when it's a good time to buy. Bigger Pockets posted, I saw this morning, 27.9% jump in mortgage applications during the week ending January 13th, which is the steepest recorded since the onset of the home buying boom in 2020.
Is that what's the the metric they're using for the increase? Like, is it month over month, week over week?
I don't know that.
It's probably week over week.
That's a
over
tricky
week.
measure right now. We did the mortgage application
Because they
episode
started
ago.
so low.
Well, we've just seen such significant decline during the chaos. But I think to Luke's point, it seems like now that rates are stabilizing, we've talked about this in terms of our crystal ball for next year. If with rates stabilizing, more people are like, okay, this is my new normal, but I still want to buy a house, so I might as well get back out there again.
That's still a massive jump, though.
Yeah, as long as
it's
it's,
going to add a lot of buyers to the market.
it in theory should, based on our what we've seen in terms of mortgage applications tend to lead to buyer activity.
And the fact that you're not going to see refinances right now, probably because
Yes.
the rates are too high.
Yep.
Well, let's get off of the would you rather. That was probably the longest one we've ever had. Into today's topic, which is the producer price index. Yes, another index. We love these, and we're excited to teach you about this one, which is basically a leading indicator in some of the other indexes we've talked about. We're going to talk about where you can track it, why it matters, and how you can use this data to, again, position yourself as a real estate expert in any situation wherever you're at. To start, explain kind of what the producer price index is on a basic level.
Yeah, sure. First, I want to comment on this really cute book that Josh made for me. He gave himself...
I want him the shortest, smallest font possible.
I forgot my reading glasses.
Here's mine.
But I'm going to do my best today, guys, okay?
Do you want me to take this one then?
No, I got it.
Okay.
So the producer price index, like Luke said, it's a leading indicator because it measures the average change in selling prices received by domestic producers for their output. And I think one big question we talked about before this podcast was whether that includes products, that they're getting outside of our country or not. And I think we can get into kind of why that would matter if that is included. I don't know if we ever answered that question, but
It is. So it's any product that a producer who's in the United States buys.
perfect.
Receives,
So
yeah.
if they're making the
Receives.
final product in the United States,
Counts.
what does it cost for them to get all the widgets that go into making that
Exactly.
product, which is important, and we'll get into that a little bit later probably. But it's similar to the CPI, right, where it's indexed, so it's measuring over time how much things are changing from a certain baseline. But this one's very important because it's the producer, right? So it's happening before the product has gotten to the consumer from the C of the CPI. So it's a very leading indicator of where the CPI might be going. And it's something that the Fed is tracking very closely.
Yeah, and if you want to really distill it down to a simple look at it, right? The CPI we talk about constantly. We literally don't shut up about it on our podcast, right? The CPI is the cost to you as the consumer. So if you go into a Target store, they're measuring how much the price of those goods is changing over time. Market basket, how is fuel changing over time, et cetera, as the consumer. The producer price index is just the cost to the people who are making the goods. So it's two different indexes that are doing very similar things, but one is measuring the cost to buy on the front end that is going to be essentially resold or put into raw materials, put into an actual finished good. The CPI is measuring the finished goods and how those prices are changing. The reason AJ said it's a leading indicator is because if you think about it, if the cost of the inputs is going up, the cost of the outputs is likely going to go up as well. And so it helps you understand where inflation is likely going to be going down the road.
Can we comment on Josh using the correct plural for index?
That was
Indices.
good.
It's pretty good. I would have said indexes,
That was pretty good.
but it's indices because English,
Because English.
Tell us where the agents can track the producer price index and why they should care to continue to stay up.
Yeah, so it's the government publishes it. So the CPI you can find on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. As we mentioned earlier, highly correlated with inflation numbers. That's really important because inflation numbers tend to impact the Fed's behavior, and the Fed's behavior tends to impact 30-year mortgage rates. So we've kind of talked through that chain of events a lot of times, but that's why the CPI is so important. But think of the PPI as another index that essentially PPI goes to CPI, CPI goes to Fed behavior goes to overnight rate goes to 30-year interest rate.
10-year.
And the 10-year treasury goes to 30-year interest rate. But yeah, so it's another one that you can track on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. And it just kind of helps ensure that you have a good idea of what's going on there.
Well, I think one thing though that we had conversation about is they're not always a one-to-one thing, and I think we'll get into those numbers here in a minute. But like the PPI does not always equal the CPI 3 months from now, right?
Correct.
So, and I guess to really get dorky but not get way too in the weeds, I mean, you think about like I mentioned, if they're getting product outside of the country, currency then starts to really matter. How much is the dollar? worth versus the yen or versus the pound or a euro. Like that all impacts how this all works.
Yep.
Because if they're buying it in a different currency, that will change the exchange and what the actual cost of that product is, and the labor that they're using to make that happen, obviously, but also the profit margins, right? So if there is an immense amount of demand for, widget B, and there's a very little supply of widget B, then company that makes that widget can actually charge a larger profit margin, and so the CPI would be outpacing that PPI number. Whereas if it was the other way around, it might be underperforming versus the CPI. So
yeah, like the example would be like take the masks during the pandemic, right? So the cost of producing masks, at least in the short run, didn't necessarily go up. So the PPI would have stayed about flat, but the reality is there was a ton of demand for a product randomly, and so people could, or even hand sanitizer, right? The cost of producing hand sanitizer didn't just go up, and so then the price went up on the other side due to demand. Once the demand happened and went nuts and there was like, oh shoot, we have a shortage of this, the cost side likely went up because the materials were more sparse to find. And so therefore your PPI would come up at the later point and then your demand side would shift at that point. So they tend to move it together, but to AJ's point, random spikes in supplier demand or realities around profit margins and markets necessarily could create a different reality.
And you could probably argue that in the last 2 years compared to any couple years in a long time, we've had a lot of random spikes in demand and supply.
Yeah, 10 years from now, we'll look back on that 2020, 2022 timeframe and just say those were the years that you kind of throw out because they were just too weird.
Outliers.
Yeah, you can't really use them for anything.
So let's get into the numbers and what they've looked like historically. So I think this graph we have goes back to the 90s. Tell us kind of what that's looked like from the 90s up until like the 2010s.
Yeah, so, I think this is mostly a technologically driven thing, but between 1990 even, and 2005 or 6, it didn't really deviate more than 5-ish% either direction. Most of the time it was up between 1 and 5% on an annual basis. So that's when compared to the previous year. And it only went down negative a couple of different times. Now, you saw it like later on where it, before the Great Recession, right before 2010, where it really went down pretty drastically and rapidly, and then popped back up after that. So, and now we're seeing some really weird activity in that PPI. I don't know if you want to get into that, Luke.
Yeah, tell us. So that was historically. Tell us what that's looked like in the last couple of years.
Well, I think again, I think this is a technologically driven thing because the availability of the data, the way that we can just like receive, consume, and make decisions really, really fast now, because the internet is making things very available to consumers, business owners, everybody.
You would even say compared to like 2008.
Exactly.
You probably would have seen that number move quicker than it did.
It would have been way worse.
And it would have been faster than...
Way faster.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it would have returned probably way quicker than it did. Mm-hmm. And so, not to get in the weeds on that, but like a lot of people are thinking like, could we figure out a way to make recessions maybe happen but not be as bad in this age of technology where we're making decisions in real time and making way better decisions with way more information, right? But now we've seen, the most recent one in 2021 was 17% up on the PPI.
Just higher than anything we've ever seen going back as far as this stat is tracked.
Up or down.
And we haven't seen the inflation follow even at that pace.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to see that. But yeah, it's twice as high as we've seen since 1990 on our graph here.
It would be cool to see an overlay of the CPI on this.
Yeah, and I'm guessing they would correlate really well. The reality is we kind of knew it was coming, right? So the reality of the shortages with the supply chain as a function of COVID, all the things that messed up. When you think about China and India getting closed down, what that does to your supply side economics, you're going to naturally have cost increases once that starts back up. You layer in a war that's going to also create a lot of shortages in raw materials. Things like wheat, for example, coming out of the Ukraine, you have a lot of problems from that. That's going to naturally just create some of these spikes in the cost side. And so people talk about inflation a lot, and there's a lot of different things people complain about with inflation, but the reality is a lot of this is supply side driven and as a function of just what's happened in the last 2 years. And so when costs and the front end for producers go up, you've seen the CPI and the inflation numbers follow. Now, the hope would be that we continue to see positive news in both of these metrics, because if we do get that tends to mean that the activity that the Fed is taking is doing what we needed it to do to kind of cool the market and cool the inflation numbers. And if that happens, that's when we'll continue to start to see mortgage rates stabilize and potentially start going backwards.
And you'd argue too that this Fed overnight rate impacts everything. It doesn't just impact the demand side, like where consumers are now rethinking, like, should I have this credit card balance because now it's 28% rather than 20, but it also impacts, if a company is growing and they're borrowing lots of money, they're probably buying less product if it costs them a lot more money to borrow. So you can see the PPI come down and the CPI kind of work together from the demand and the supply side, I think, with the action.
The goal is to cool the whole market, right? We talk a lot about how it impacts mortgage rates. That's one piece of this puzzle, but the reality is the Fed's behavior is intended to just cool the whole market, slow everything down, let it kind of come to a stabilization point where prices will settle in. And then at that point, the expectation would be the Fed will say, okay, our actions have been working. We can start peeling this back a little bit. The reason why that's important for anyone listening to this is when the Fed starts peeling this back and essentially says we're either in a recession or the market has cooled, that's when the 10-year will start to go down. That's when the mortgage rates will start to go down. And so you will start to see that activity kind of push back towards a direction that you're comfortable with. The reality is that end place will probably not be the 2-3% range that we were in before, because that was more a function of the Fed going, a lot of stuff is wrong. We need to heat up the economy.
It should never be 3% ever again.
It shouldn't.
In my opinion.
But I don't think it's going to stay at 6 to 7, right?
No,
so you're going to probably see it settle in at 5, and that will be fine, and people will be comfortable. But that's just, when you think about all of these metrics we're talking about, the reality is all of it impacts behaviors that then will impact your life and your job. So that's why it's so important to be tracking this stuff.
I pulled up the most recent stats on this just so we could give that to the listeners. One, if you literally look up producer price index and you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just like the consumer price index, it's got this like front page where it shows you everything and summarizes stuff without having to dig too deep. So it's pretty easy to digest, I would say. But it says that from December 21 to December 22, we saw a 6.2% increase. So instead of that 17, it was 6.2. So it's definitely went down.
And it went down, I think, month over month as well for the first time.
It did. So in December, it was declined 0.5%.
And that actually did have an impact on mortgage rates. So I think we saw a 15 or 20 basis point decrease in mortgage rates when that was released. Okay. So once again, positive news on that means inflation is likely to be seen as being more in check, which means that they believe that the Fed will then say, okay, if PPI and CPI are stabilizing, then we won't need to necessarily continue this rate increase on the overnight rate. That dropped the 10-year Treasury down, that dropped the 30-year mortgage rate down, because the behaviors we've been seeing from the Fed are, in their mind, working. And so they're expecting future behaviors that are either in line with expectations or even less aggressive than they were assuming.
So we've been jumping around a little bit today. I want to finish off with the script of the week. The script of the week is you're with your friends and you're on a winter hike, is what Josh wanted it to be.
Yeah, winter hike.
It's a little bit
-3. Get outside.
A little bit too cold to be on a winter hike today. You're with some of your friends. You get to the summit, and you look over the ledge, and you see the
We're basically on Everest in Minnesota right now.
We're on Everest.
All the land that you see here, son.
One of your friends looks at you and goes, how does this inflation stuff impact your world in real estate and your job?
You're like, Stu, we're at the summit. Just enjoy the view. Can
I
I have a break from my job, please?
Do I have to be prepared for questions on real estate at all points in my life?
Yes.
Yes, you do. The answer is yes. So how does this inflation stuff impact your world in real estate? Script of the week.
Like our hike up this mountain, on the way up, the inflation can lead to lots of uncertainty, and you're not sure if you're ever going to reach a more stable environment. But Stu, that's his name, right? Stu.
Yeah, Stu is your friend.
But Stu, now that we've reached the peak, you can see how beautiful it is on the other side. I'm just kidding. You could say something like that.
Yeah, that actually
But I mean, in that moment, you should be doing that.
Works.
I think we've talked a lot about this, and I would tell somebody, when inflation is going up very quickly and all the news seems very, very bad and the rates are rising, but they're also jumping like up and down on the way up, because that inflation stuff impacts those mortgage rates because it impacts those Fed decisions. Mm-hmm. When that's happening, it creates a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. And when consumers are making large decisions like buying a home, buying a car, you've seen used car prices come down. When they're making these big decisions, big money decisions, they're not super happy to make them in uncertain and volatile environments. So now that we've seen the inflation numbers come out better, we're not like seeing a snap back the other direction, but better, the Fed's saying or signaling, hey, we're not going to really go crazy anymore. We've done the crazy stuff. We're going to level off a little bit. That's flowing through into the 10-year treasury yield, the bond markets, and making mortgage rates stay right around 6% is kind of what we've been seeing. And to be honest, Stu, what that's done for us is it's made it so that buyers feel more certain. They might not like 6%, but they can deal with it given that they know that it's not going to be 8 tomorrow and maybe 5.5 the next day.
Yep.
So certainty and just less volatility has led to our marketplace kind of like taking a deep sigh of relief and getting back out there in business as usual.
Perfection.
I love that.
Okay.
That's all we have for you today on the Nerdy Agent Podcast. We will see you next week. And remember, be better.